Good morning, everybody. I'd first like to start out by welcoming you all to, well, people in this building, to the Sycus Traditional Territory. And our special guest today is Sarah John, and she is the granddaughter of Mary John.
So here is a picture of Sarah, and so yeah, she's the granddaughter of Mary, and she will be here to answer questions, tell some stories. I'm sure we can get her talking. So good morning.
Good morning.
And so if you guys read through your chapters up to through chapter 8, right? Then that was the section that was talking about when students first began non-voluntarily going to school. And we do have one video here that should work with us. So I will see if this works for us to see if this works this way and see if we can see the video. There we go. See if I can get it to work.
And to tell the story of the Jesus so he was 10 years old, and his father had not wanted him to his family. His father didn't want him to go to residential school to attack. But eventually the police and the agency came and said, you know, you have to send this boy to school. So choose to go to attack and they were running an attack. His very first half hour in the attack. And his brother came who was being there before him. No little bit of the routine at the start. And so the priest comes to Susan and he starts taking Susan's clothes. Susan's wearing, so Susan turns to his brother Teddy, and of course he thinks, well, even she just takes care of her. So he said to Teddy and Jerry, why are they taking my own clothes? And he said the priest hit him so hard that he just fell on top of the wall. And the priest said to him, we don't do that, and we should.
So I know for most of us, at least in my home, if my daughter says a bad word or says a foul word, or my husband says a bad word, we say, we don't talk like that here. But I couldn't imagine going somewhere and have someone tell me that I couldn't speak my own language as if it were a swear word or something completely negative. So that was Bridget Moran, who was the lady who wrote the book about Mary John. Oh, you couldn't hear anything. Okay, sorry. You guys couldn't hear. Okay. So what I will do is let's try that again. Okay. So give me a second here. Okay. Can you guys see the video on the screen there? I'm going to play the video again and hopefully you can hear it this time.
And to tell the story of it, he first came to school. He was 10 years old, and his father had not wanted him to have his family. His father didn't want him to go to attack. But eventually the police and the agency came and said, you know, you have to send this boy to school. So choose to go to attack and they were on an attack. His very first half hour in the attack. And his brother Teddy, who was being there before him, no little bit of the routine at the start. And so the priest comes to Susan and he starts taking Susan's clothes. And Susan's wearing, so Susan turns to his brother Teddy, and of course he thinks, well, maybe she just takes care of her. So he said to Teddy and Jerry, why are they taking my own clothes? And he said the priest hit him so hard that he just fell on top of the wall. And the priest said to him, we don't do that, and we should.
Okay, so you guys still couldn't hear that video. So Kaylee, could you hear that video? That is not really. Okay. What we will do then again is I will email out the link to the video. It's odd because I could hear it all on this end, so I don't know where it's not coming through. But basically, Bridget Moran was saying was telling the story of a young boy. Okay, you can watch it on your Google Chrome, that's fine, because you guys have the link. Basically, she was saying that Justa went to the school. The Indian agent and the police came to say, no, you need to go to school, and took him from his home and took him out to LeJac, which is about 45 minutes from Vanderhoof here, from Stoney Creek. And they were taking off his clothes, and so Justa said to his older brother in Carrier, why are they taking off my clothes? And the priest turned around and hit him so hard and told him, we don't use that language here. So basically telling him that his language, his own Carrier language was like was against the law. It was a filthy language that they weren't allowed to use. So I know, like I was saying before, I couldn't imagine going somewhere and being told that I couldn't use my language and being hit for it, physically assaulted and told basically that my language was dirty and horrible, right? So those are the things that really hit home to me. There were those little things, thinking about what freedom I have. And Nikki went to a conference a couple of years ago. So she was not quite sure who gave her this old copy of a report card, but I know that when we look at our report cards nowadays, everything's electronic, everything is on the computer. We don't see this cursive writing anymore. Right here, handwriting, we don't see this type of writing. But you would have the pupil's name, and this is a student who was going into grade 8. Is that what we thought? Okay, grade 8. And so there's a little bit of a blurb at the bottom here for the parents or guardians. And so this was from, the year was 1950 and 1951. And you see here the dates absent and times late, so that's something standard that we see across the board here. And on the next slide, we'll see the sort of things that people would get graded for at these residential schools were things like health, silent reading, writing, and then down here for the variable is like training, home ec, agriculture. But there were a couple that I'm just looking here, the health habits over here. To sit, stand, walk, and behave correctly, to keep clothes, hands, face, teeth clean. So students were getting marks for these things. To cover the mouth when coughing was even something that they would get marks for. And it makes me wonder, it makes me see really how far I guess we've come for things that we report on. However, it's sad to see that those are the types of things that they got marked for as well. So this is just something that was really neat to look at, and you can see over on the sides here they did have the four terms, 4 semesters, and then at the end they would receive their, you're passed on to your next grade. So very interesting. Pardon me. It was very interesting to look at, right, and see the little things that students got marks for at these schools. So again, that's the 1950s. And then just a couple of facts that Nikki found here was that the federal government and the churches, that there were over 130 residential schools across Canada. The number of active schools was at its peak in 1931, so just before the Second World War, and that was 80. So 80 active schools at one time throughout our whole country. And then the last one, this is what really shocked me, because I think 1996, I was just finishing grade 9 and going into high school myself in grade 10, and to think that at that point in time, students my age were forced to go to schools that weren't anywhere near their parents, right? So students that were 12, 13 years old were still taken and put into situations away from their family, away from their true supports, and taught to act certain ways. Over 150,000 children, some were as young as 4, so younger than kindergarten age, were attending the federally run schools. That the attendance was mandatory. They had to go there for Aboriginal children across Canada. And if you didn't send your children to school, you would get punished. You could be put into prison. So it wasn't a choice. You were, like you might have heard in the video there, the police came and took them away, right? And in response to the loss of language, there's growing movements to revive and preserve unique cultural beliefs societal structures and spiritual beliefs among the Aboriginal people of Canada. A lot of languages are sort of down to that, the oldest generation are the only ones that speak the dialect of their culture, and really the younger generation either doesn't want to learn it or doesn't have a desire to learn it, right?
I'm not the resource.
Right. So Sarah, do you speak Carrier? Totally putting you on the spot.
So I don't speak Carrier, but I did go to a Carrier-run school, which was in Fort St. James, where my grandma actually went to the boarding school, which is called Nakalpan now. And it was formerly called St. Murray Grey, which was run by the Catholics. And after, with the residential school, with the response to the loss of language, there was a lack of enrollment for their kids. So they were going to shut down the Catholic school, but instead the First Nations took over the school, and it became a First Nations run school. And so I was lucky enough to be a young person entering into grade 8 in 1996, thinking about all of the federally run schools, and feeling blessed that I was able to have a Carrier teacher and to have Carrier people who are like me teach me about reading and writing and math as well as the language. So I did get to learn the basic sounds and nouns of the language, but the language is very complex. So it's one of the hardest languages to learn, more than English. So you can imagine what it felt like for students to go from speaking their language to speaking a totally foreign language.
For sure, now that school is bursting at the seams, and it's not just Aboriginal children or Aboriginal parents that are sending their children to Nakalpan nowadays. It's the Caucasian families are sending them there because it's a lot more hands-on. They do go out and they pick berries, they go out ice fishing, they go out and do things hands-on, learn about the land. So a lot of the stuff that it's funny, I guess, because our new curriculum that's coming out for the government, provincially run schools is a lot more hands-on. So a lot more following that Nakalpan type model where students go out and learn the things and do the things, very similar to how the school is run in Fort St. James. So it is a very well-regarded school in Fort St. James now, for sure.
So I came up with a few questions just to maybe have a bit of a discussion with Sarah here. And I mean, they're pretty heavy questions, and I just wanted to see if you had any stories that you picked up over your years that you could or feel comfortable sharing. Just anything, someone told you a story about something or whatever. So we had a little bit of information about what happened to families that they didn't send their kids, but I wanted to know if you had any firsthand, or not firsthand, but stories that you had been told about hardships that came from that. So we could start with the first one. Can you share any stories of people's first experience being taken from their families to go to residential schools? And
yeah, so there are many stories that are told within each families. Some stories are more easier to tell than others. But I guess I'll just start by telling one of the stories that I've heard as a young girl, and how my grandma related those stories to my life as a young girl in elementary school. And she sort of talked about the story of going to residential school and how she felt when she left was somewhat to imagine yourself going on a field trip, and what that's like going on a field trip when you're packing up everything and getting ready to, go to, whatever place the school is going to take you, and how exciting that is for students when you're going to go on a big field trip somewhere. Everybody gets excited for field trips. And yet sometimes you don't know where you're going to go or what it's going to be like at that place that you're going. And so there's sometimes you get, a little worried or frightened as to what's going to happen because you don't know what's there. So Granny used to tell me that it sort of feels like a big field trip, but you don't know when you're going to come home. So the difference between is that we all know that we can go and have fun on these field trips, but we always know that we're going to come home. And so she said the difference was that not knowing when it is that you get to go home. So she said there was excitement to go to school and to be able to learn English and math and everything that was so important for us today. But at the same time, there was a bit of a resistance to when they were going to come home, because they knew that home was also important to learn how to be with their families and to be out on the land and to pick berries, to do all the things that the First Nations speak their own language at home. So, so that was one really great story that I thought was helped me to understand what it was like.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. That's a really good analogy there with the field trip, because you do have that sense of a little bit of anxiety about not knowing where you're going, but you're also really excited. But could you imagine that never ends, and then it becomes this nightmare, right?
Yeah.
You never get to leave until 10 months later.
Yes.
So, all right. Have you heard of any stories about what happened to families that resisted sending their kids to residential schools?
Yeah, there are lots of stories of families who resisted sending their kids to a residential school, and we've all heard the stories about if your kid, if you're in with your peers and you're all playing and you're having a good time and your mom says it's time for you to come in. Sometimes you don't want to come in because you're having so much fun playing. Well, it's that feeling of resistance when you want to stay outside playing, but mom's like, you got to come in, you have to take a bath, you have to have your supper, you have to go to bed, there's school tomorrow. So sometimes we don't want to do the things that mom and dad tells us to, but we know that it's the best thing for us. So some parents would just be okay because they knew that they had to send their kids because they could risk their own freedom, so they would send their kids. But there were some families who just had such a difficult time letting go of their young children, as young as 4 years old. So you can imagine your baby sister, your baby brother going off to school and not to see them again, and how maybe worried your mom would be if that kid got sick, or your little brother got sick and they weren't there when they were sick. So you could feel that the parents would be quite worried about them. So they would often hide their kids in attics and basements and in other family members' houses, so that the priests and the police and the Indian agents of the time wouldn't find them. But that came along with really great risk to the families. And so most of the time the families would just send their kids, but they did try very hard to be part of the kids' experience at residential school. So for the people who didn't hide their kids from the people taking the kids to school, often they would travel along the wagon behind them and camp outside the residential school so that the kids could feel that they were close by. But often, because they were so close and the kids would be more homesick for them and want to speak with their parents in their language and things like that, often the police had to tell the families that were camping to go back home. So it was difficult times. And it was very sad. And it was sad, but there was also lots of families and kids staying together, through the summertime as much as they could, and spending as much time, quality time as they could before the kids had to go off to school again.
Awesome. Yeah, again, great analogy again, right? That you started with there. That's really helpful to have that kind of perspective, and just I would imagine that's kind of just the sum of kind of what you've taken in from different stories and stuff. So that's excellent. So the next question comes from, I can't remember what page it was on. It was in chapter 8, maybe? I'm not sure. But this is in response to, this question is asking, basically it's a quote from the chief at the time in Stoney Creek Woman. Tell me, what is the matter with LeJack? So he's talking to the parents that are complaining to him, saying, hey, this school isn't as great as it sounds like. We don't want to send our kids. And so the chief responds, tell me, what is the matter with LeJack? Why are you coming to me every summer with this request? And so I was wondering if you've ever heard any stories about why that would be, why would you respond that way? I would imagine there's probably a lot of politics there that would have to be played. So I wanted to hear maybe if you had any stories or anything in relation to that.
So the chief at the time, his name was Adamas Alexis, and Adamas was Granny Mary John's I think uncle-in-law or something, a relative anyways. And he was a really great chief that many of the people in our community speak highly of, because he understood the needs of everyone in the community, kids and parents, and as well as the priests and the police and the Indian agents in the changing times. And when parents would come to him to talk about LeJac and what was the matter with LeJac, it was more along the lines of that the kids were at LeJac were hungry, and they only got 2 square meals a day, and the kids at home were so used to having as much food as they really required to give their body the nutrition that it needs, that we all need. And often they would be fed moldy bread, and you can imagine eating moldy bread for breakfast with dry mush, which is hot cereal, which is our porridge in the morning that we like, and with lard. And lard is something that is a greasy butter shortening that you would put on fat, which is the fat that you would put on your moldy bread. And they were seeing the kids, you know, everyone knows when, as kids, that we know that when somebody else has a better lunch than us. Sometimes we get a little, you know, maybe, you know, we feel like we deserve that good lunch too, and we run back and we ask our parents, can we have, you know, granola bars in our lunch too, because we saw our friend have granola bars, so we want that too. So the kids would run back to their families and say, well, we've seen the priests and the nuns, and they were having, you know, these 3 square meals a day, much better than what they were feeding us, and so that's what we want too. So those were some of the things that the chief was asking, that the children got the same treatment and same nutritional value as the people teaching them. And the other complaint that they talked about often was around the hard work that they had to endure while they were just children, you know, 4 or 5 years old. Because you can imagine trying to get a school as big as LeJac heated by a wood fire. Well, that requires chopping wood, piling wood, packing wood inside. And so you can imagine being a 5-year-old little girl or little boy and having to do this huge amount of hard work. And the Native kids were used to hard work because they lived with their families, but it was almost too hard for them, for a little kid to have that kind of responsibility without any help from the adults or the parents. And so the parents and adults nowadays always make sure that their kids are safe and that the kids have just enough work that they can handle, not to be too much for them. So that was the other thing that the chief often complained about, was it was just too much hard work for such young children.
And I remember reading in the book there too that LeJac is situated on the lake, right? And they would want, the children would say, but why can't we just go fish? Like, we want food, we're hungry, and we know how to fish. Can we just let us go get our own food? And they wouldn't even, you know, they weren't allowed to do that even. So they weren't even, you know, able to use their skills to help rectify their own problems. Right? They couldn't even problem solve or get their own nutritious food. Yeah.
To watch the berries bloom.
Yeah, and you can't go get them. Yeah. So it was very, when I read that part, I was very surprised.
Well, that's like the ultimate frustration. You're not, that's beyond not even honoring someone's personal experience kind of thing, or their own knowledge, right? I mean, that's kind of all we talk about these days, and that's so important. We know through all kinds of studies that it's really important to acknowledge people's past experiences, that kind of thing, within an educational environment. But to actually put them in a situation where they can solve the problem and then not allow them to solve the problem, and it's within a sight line, like they can actually see what they need and they can't get it. So with the story about Chief, what was his name?
Adonais Alexis.
Adonais Alexis. Okay. So Chief Adonais Alexis sounds like he did do a lot of advocating for the kids, but it seemed like he was trying to mediate between the two groups. Mostly, I would imagine it sounds like it was because he knew the reality of the situation. He knew how hard it could be if they resisted it.
Yeah.
He was probably trying to do what he could in that situation for the kids, right?
Yeah.
So, That's nice to hear because I didn't know about that, and that's something that I just talked about a whole bunch, kind of like what sort of politics play with the leaders of the communities and with these schools, because I mean, it's the federal government, you can't just say no, what's going to happen, right? So that's something interesting to talk about too, because a lot of people don't realize that this was a 100% forced thing by law, like this was,
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah.
So Sarah, do you have any stories about children that tried to leave?
Yeah, so the stories that I have of the children that tried to leave are often from my mother's territory, which is in Fort St. James, which is where the day school was prior to going to LeJac, which was the residential school. And often the kids at the day school, at the boarding school in Fort St. James, they would run back to Stoney Creek. But because in those days, they'd be running home at times where they really want to be with your family, which is like Christmas, and everybody wants to be with their family at Christmas. And sometimes the parents didn't have enough money, or they didn't have a wagon, or the resources or the transportation to get back to Fort St. James to pick up their kids. Or sometimes they didn't even know that the kids were being released for Christmas or being sent home for Christmas, so they didn't even know to go pick them up. And so the kids would be waiting at the boarding school or at LeJac, one or the other, to go home. And can you imagine if your parent didn't come to pick you up just because they didn't know? And all in the meantime, the people at the boarding school are saying, well, maybe they just forgot about you. And so how that must feel for a child to not go home on Christmas, so you would just run home. And that became very risky for the kids, because it was, in the dead of winter, and back in those days, the winters were really cold. And so the kids risked their life in order to run home for Christmas. And so we're really blessed today that our parents are able to know when Christmas break is happening and when all the kids get to go home, just like everyone else on our Christmas, to spend time with each other. And we don't have to run home in the cold to get home with our families.
You say run home, but it was like a 50 kilometer
run.
Trek through waist-deep snow with no shoes probably.
Yes, no.
And not proper clothing. Like this is like a.
You didn't have your snow pants.
Yeah, you didn't have your snow pants or your snow jackets or your snow boots.
This was a very, very dangerous thing to do.
Yeah.
So we're kind of forced into that situation.
Yeah.
Yes, Kaylee, did you have a question? Sorry, I turned off the chat box there so we could stay on topic, but it's on now. And if anybody else has questions as well,
feel free to type them in. We can address them as they come in. What stood out for you in this chapter? Did anybody have anything that stood out for them? Maybe a story or something they want to just relate to us, let us know that it stood out to them. Maybe it'd be something we could talk about. Maybe a piece of vocabulary or
yeah, go ahead, Kaylee. So the chat box is on, but I'm not seeing anything come in. So I see Adria typing something.
Yeah, it says that the chat box isn't on my computer, so I'm actually typing to you in private, so.
Oh, I pressed the wrong. There we go. Okay, now it's on. Sorry about that.
So we got 3 questions coming in. We'll just give them a moment to type it up again. Well, how do you spell the chief's name?
What chapter should you be on? So we usually, so for this farm, up to chapter 8.
So chapter 9.
So up to chapter 9. So everything, so this one's, the chapters that we've read were mostly about the residential schools. And if you're not that far, or if you're further, that's fine as well.
The chief's name, that's I don't know.
How do you spell it?
The chief's name is spelled Adonas. Alexis, A-L-E. There we go.
Adonis, so that's a good one.
Adonas.
Adonis.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yes.
So Sarah, can you tell us something about the two young boys that left and didn't make it home in the winter from LeJac? No.
Oh yeah. The two young boys that left from LeJac, yeah, they froze, and that's really sad. Was a really sad time for the families because it made them think about all of the other children who were going from other residential schools across Canada and across British Columbia, who also had to run away. And so all of the families that had to go through grieving and and loss because of kids and wanting to be home so badly that they would risk their lives to run home.
So were they brothers?
No, they were cousins. They were cousins. And often in the residential school, they would separate the families from one another, so they would segregate the girls from the boys. But if they figured out along the way that two were brothers, they would also separate the brothers and sisters from each other as well. So they would separate families as they figured out who was brothers to who was cousins to who, because they really wanted to make sure that separation was happening.
Yeah, just the strength in numbers, I would think they would think, right? So if we break them down and everybody comes home.
Because often it was, your little brother or your big brother who was saying, let's run home together, and let's get out of here. And so then they would wait for all the kids to come into the banquet hall, and that's when they came into the banquet hall to eat or to maybe do prayer or to maybe do like somewhat of an assembly, like we all know assemblies, right? So when all the kids get together in an assembly, that's when the teachers have the hardest time to supervise all the kids at one time because they're not all in the classroom. So that was the kids' feeling of opportunity to sneak out the assembly doors and run away when all of the teachers couldn't see that happening.
So are there any other questions for Sarah?
Comments?
I guess one of those connection things that comes up with me is that my grandmother lived through the time of Adolf Hitler. She was a young girl in Germany during the Second World War, and a lot of the stories that you hear of that time are about, so as Sarah mentioned, hiding kids in attics or hiding them away from the police coming to the door is very similar to, I'm sure you guys have heard of Anne Frank, the story of Anne Frank where the police were hunting her down to put her in a concentration camp, which really, when you think of what a concentration camp is not a lot different than the daily functioning of a residential school, the work, the poor meals, and then people also trying to escape, and people not always surviving that escape, young and old. So that's a connection that I made, especially reading through these chapters. Are there any other questions or comments or any connections that you might have? I mean, I'm sure we think nowadays to things like things that are happening in, a lot of migrants trying to leave countries that are run similarly to these residential school ideas where they pass away, right? They're trying to escape, right? So Mary John went to one of her teacher's houses, and she would have to cross the boys' school park. So the girls and boys were not meant to be really interacting. Mm-hmm. So she would have to sneak across.
And she said she was always really, Granny Mary said she was always really a shy student, and so she always didn't like to run by the boys' park because they would be teasing her and saying, making remarks about her crossing the boys' park and teacher's pet. Yeah. Why would they?
Why would they be so mean to her? So why would the boys be so mean to her?
Well, you know how boys can be.
Yeah, because they boys are boys.
Well, because the boys and the girls in the First Nations communities, they were so used to being together, and when you're together, you're learning how to respect each other. And so when you're separated like that and you don't learn how to respect one another because you're separated from one another, then you're not having an opportunity to kind of get into, you know, say the wrong thing and learn that that wasn't a very nice thing to say. So with so much separation happening in the schools, you know, the boys and the girls sort of just lost touch with how to respect one another across the genders. And so that's something that we are still learning today, how to respect one another and how to be courteous and be friendly with one another. And we are, but that was something that was definitely affected by the residential schools.
Good question.
Yeah, very good question.
Are there any other questions or thoughts on the readings that you've done so far?
You don't have to be stuck in just the last 4 chapters. You can think about the whole book up till now. Yeah. I think we have a couple of questions coming in, maybe.
Yeah, it works both ways. The boys and the girls will chase each other or whatnot, right?
My granny said that when they would go out into the yard and they used to sneak into the boys' yard sometimes, or the boys would sneak into the girls' yard. And sometimes when they'd come from town, right, they'd be allowed to go to the store before going to Le Jack, and they would buy bubble gum. And bubble gum was always a hot commodity at the residential school. And my granny said that they would chase boys around who had the gum, and they'd take the gum from their mouth and they'd chew it themselves. And you always had a lineup that once the girls got the gum, it was already chewed up. And then all of your little girlfriends would say, well, I get the next chew. I get the next gum, and they'd do lineup. And she said she always thought, but later when she was older, she goes, oh, that must not have been so hygienic. Because we were all sharing the same gum.
Oh.
But that just goes to show how little fun that they had available to them. You know, not everybody could even have gum. And so you're all fighting in the lineup just to have a chance to chew on some gum.
Right, and missing. I know that, you know, oftentimes we don't get along with our siblings nowadays, right? But if you were forcibly removed from them or separated from them, you'd probably miss, oh, I wish I could just fight with my brother just one more time, or, right, those types of things.
Yeah,
for sure.
And in the book, Granny says that she cried as Bella, her older sister, and Mark, her older brother, got to stay home because they were older children. So the older children didn't always have to go to Le Jack because they were too old now. And so she said she was jealous that her older brothers got to stay home and her older sister got to stay home and she had to go to Le Jack. So she said she always missed them when she was leaving on the wagon, and she was crying as she waved goodbye to them.
And in regards to getting their own, well, to go to that store was a bit of a travel, so a lot of families didn't make that trip. But if you were lucky enough, right, and you had some pocket money from your trap line or whatnot, you could go, right, if your family was able to make it into town. Because nowadays it takes us, 10 minutes to drive out there, but back at this point in time, it was a longer trek by wagon, and not all families could afford to be away from their home all day.
A couple more questions coming in.
So Sarah, while we wait, can you tell me, did Le Jack or any of the residential schools have certain days parents could visit? They couldn't just show up and visit, could they?
I don't think that they could just show up and visit. It was very structured as to keep parents away, and I think the only time that the parents really got to go to see the kids was when they had to pick them up for Christmas and drop them off for fall.
To give some perspective on how far we've been to journey from LeJac to Vanderhoof. I mean, at that time, how far is it? It's like 40 kilometers, something like that, 60 kilometers from here. By wagon, that would take like a day. Like it would take them quite a while. So that's an interesting perspective to have.
Yeah, like when you think about driving a car, you drive for a whole day and you get to Calgary from Vanderhoof, or you get to Vancouver from Vanderhoof. Whereas for them, in a wagon, it would take them a whole day to cover less distance than from Vanderhoof to Prince George, right? 60 kilometers is not far for us nowadays when you think of right in the grand scheme.
And to give some more perspective, there are places right now, for example, in Fort Nelson, I taught a lot of students from the band there that had never been out of town because it's 4 hours to the nearest town. And that already still is too far of a distance. I mean, families that don't have money, don't have the car, or they don't have the gas money to make that round trip. So I had students who had never driven 4 hours of the highway, right?
And so, Fort St. James was the same, even though it's only 2 hours from Prince George, that's still 2 hours of gas, 2 hours of having a car, plus whatever you're doing in Prince George, right? And then you're getting back to really 4 hours in a car.
So think about today with our modern conveniences, how difficult even 4 hours of a drive is, where a couple of days in a wagon, which should have been the same kind of cost, same dynamic, time away from home. Someone's going to watch your dog, someone's going to watch your infants or whatever, right? So kind of keep that in mind.
I like the book too. I find it's not an easy read, but once you start reading it, it flows. Like you don't realize how many pages you've actually read.
Yeah, it's very compelling.
Yeah.
Very compelling.
Yeah. Are there any other questions for Sarah? Yeah, to see your friends, right? Or even back then, I think you'd miss your hunting, your all those family gatherings that they would do, right? They would go as a family to their KO. They would go and set up camp as a family. They would do all of those things as a family, and not just brothers, sisters, but cousins and everybody else. So I think you'd miss that routine or the non-routine.
So just one more thought or thing for Sarah. Do you have a favorite granny story?
A favorite granny story? I do, but it's not the one to tell here. My favorite granny story, there are so many granny stories, so it's hard to just pick one. We have lots of stories that our parents tell us that, that get us excited. And I guess my favorite granny story is of her time being back home. And so it's her stories of going to LeJac and talking about how they always had mush, which is the porridge, and and how hard it was to be there, and the joy that they felt to come home to their communities. And so my granny told a story about how excited she was to come home, and they all went to church. Everybody went to church in the village on Sunday, and everybody cleaned up on Friday and Saturday. So the kids were always really excited to clean up Friday and Saturday, clean up their houses nicely for Sunday. And so they would go to Mass on Sunday with their nice clean house and get back into the routine of being at home. And when they got to the church, they would sing English songs and hymns. And my granny said that her voice would soar across the church, and the old chief, not at a mass, another old chief, was sitting in the church, and he was just so excited how good they could speak English and how the English words would just soar from their mouth and sound beautiful type of thing. And my granny said that she always wished she could go back to that old chief because he was just marveling at how good they could speak English. And she wished she could go back to that chief and say to him that the cost to her to speak the language, which is English, the language that she learned, and the cost that it came to her own language, that she wished she could have told that chief at the time, who was marveling, that it cost her a lot, hard work, lots of neglect, and some abuse, right, in order to just speak English. And so now today we don't have to go through those experiences in order to learn English. We're very lucky. So that was one of the favorite stories that my granny shared. Yeah.
Auntie Kaylee, you had your hand up. Did you have a question?
Did they get meat?
So did they get meat? I don't know what their meals were, but I remember reading the priests would get the roast and all the sweet smells of gravy and everything, whereas the students would get whatever broth or whatnot, right? Mm-hmm. So it was never those well-rounded meals. Although the government gave them a certain amount of money, $125 per kid for the whole year. That would just go to the priests or whoever, right? And porridge. So the porridge would be for the mornings, right? Whatever they could mush up, hot water and cereal basically mushed together and then divided up amongst the kids.
Yeah, and if you wanted to be, the priests and the nuns gave the kids opportunities to compete with one another, to sit in the nuns' hall and eat the food that they got to eat. And the priests and the nuns would set the hall up really nice and fancy, and the kids who were really good and really listened and did everything that they were told and became somewhat of a teacher's pet, I guess, like my granny, they would be the ones who were invited in to have some, like maybe lunch once or supper once a month with the priest. But my granny always said that if they were chosen by the priests and the nuns to have the special meal, they would take a lot of peer teasing and grief and bullying from the other kids for their special treatment.
And Ariel, did you have a question? So did the young boys and men ride horseback? So was that, you mean like going to and from school? So when they had to travel, did they have to go by horseback?
When they were at home with their families, young boys and men, they rode horseback. But when they were going to and from the school, they would all be in the wagon or walking alongside the wagon. And they were not allowed to hunt while they were at school.
Now, are there any other questions while we still have Sarah here with us? About the book or about anything that we've discussed in this B class or any others of the B classes?
We have one more question coming in, maybe?
Horseback would probably be more comfortable than sitting in a wagon, I think. Well, more interactive.
If you were lucky enough to have a horse.
Yeah.
If your family had a horse or maybe more than one horse, I don't know.
My granny had lots of cows and horses when she was growing up, so she was a very good ranching woman. So she has lots of stories of horses, and in the book, as you read, she gives birth to one of her sons in a tent, and that is my dad that she gives birth in. She says that my dad's auntie, who was the midwife of of my dad, said, "Oh, he'll be king of the cowboys." And my dad is one of the only sons who rides horse and, and goes on pack trips and does all of the ranching stuff. So he really is one of the king of the cowboys in Stoney Creek.
And so did she, when she was in school and everything, did she miss her chores at home?
Yeah, she did miss her.
Her chores?
She did miss her chores at home. She would much rather pack water and you know, and do the things with her mother and father instead of, you know, the really hard work because she'd have her mother and father to help her do the chores as well. So it wasn't, you know, it was a family unit compared to being at the school. So I guess if I could leave you guys with one sort of like words to leave you with is that we're so lucky to have our own choice to go to school, and in Canada now today that it is a freedom of it is our right to claim an education, and that we can be safe in the schools, and that we can have the freedom to learn what it is that we want to learn, when we want, how we want. And that is always something that should have been a right way back when, but we're learning from our mistakes in Canada. And I think that my granny, if there's one thing that she could say to me when I went off to university, is that I had the choice to go to university, and how proud she was that I went to university. Despite her negative school experience, she knew that it was the right thing to do, that we all needed to have that education. But she also said that we needed to remember who we are as Aboriginal people, and to remember what our first school, early school experiences were, so that we could work through those with the rest of Canada in order so everyone could be nurtured in the schools and have that freedom, just as you're saying, Ariel. No more.
Well, thank you very much. That's very good. Very enlightening. Thank you.
And we thank the students and Kirsten for coming today as well. So thank you very, very much. And thank you to Sarah very much for taking the time from your day to come here and address our students. And we will have the recording available for those who weren't able to make it today.
Thank you. So in Carrier, when you want to say thank you from one person to many people, you say Snack Chafaya. So Snack Chafaya and Alec, which is, that is all.
So